Well, we're live for another broadcast for the Jude 3 Project podcast. I'm your host, as always, Lisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And as you notice, we're doing something different today. We're streaming through Facebook Live. So I'm very excited. Now our Jude 3 podcast will be every Monday at 7 p.m. So they won't have the random times and days. They'll be consistent on a particular day and time. And so I'm excited for us to go to this new transition, and hopefully it'll be better for all those who listen faithfully every week. So without further ado, I want to introduce another special guest to the Jude 3 Project, Mr. Stephen Harris. He will be Dr. Stephen Harris once he finishes his PhD program at Harvard University. But welcome, Stephen.
Welcome to you. I appreciate you having me on. I'm excited to have this conversation with you.
Awesome. So before we get started, for those who don't know who you are, could you just give a little bit of background?
Sure. So yeah, I currently work with the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention under the leadership of Dr. Russell Moore. So highly involved in public policy. I'm here on Capitol Hill right now. Pretty busy day. A couple of Supreme Court decisions that handed down a day and some other stuff going on. But pretty much trying to engage the public policy space for one of the largest, or the largest, Protestant denomination in the country. And that, if you can imagine, as you can imagine, entails a lot of complex realities. Particularly for one who kind of exists at the intersection of Blackness and theological conservatism. A lot of stuff I have to work out personally within my own self before I even come to Capitol Hill and try to do something useful. So that's where I labor now. Before that, doing a lot of education, which we'll probably talk about. Did some pastoral ministry in Kentucky before that. Married to a beautiful bride who I don't deserve. And we are the parents of a 2-year-old son named Jude, of all things. So, yep.
Yeah, his name goes along with Jude 3 Project. So I'm sure he's earnestly contend for the faith.
Look, that was the hope. So, Lord willing.
Awesome. So tell us about your, we want to talk about today seminaries and divinity schools, which you've been to both. I think you have a very impressive resume, and your school experience is definitely varied. I'm sure you have stories upon stories about those. For those who don't know the difference between a seminary and divinity school, can you share kind of the difference?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a long historical narrative that really unpacks this, but I think one of the things I'm always trying to help people understand is, I did an MDiv at Southern Seminary. Very much so, not just a confessional institution, but Southern is tied to a denominational entity. And so very particular in terms of theological distinctives that they are training their students in and calling their faculty to adhere to. So evangelical seminaries are very much so in the business, if you will, of training future ministers, pastors, people who are involved in full-time ministry. This is a shared kind of vision of certain divinity schools, right? MDiv programs are not just exclusive to evangelical seminaries. But one of the distinctives that I think you'll find contemporarily is the fact that in the kind of divinity school setting, you don't get that kind of coalescence around the theological distinctives, right? While certain divinity schools are still slightly tethered to kind of mainline theological orientations, certainly not as strongly as you would see in evangelical seminaries. And that's because the projects are a little different, right? So divinity schools typically are trying to not just train future practitioners, but it's training practitioners with an eye towards engaging in the kind of interreligious existence, right? And so the diversity in terms of religious belief is going to be prized and prioritized in those settings. And that's not to say that in the seminary context, you don't see diversity, but it's not as much, right? People go to particular evangelical seminaries usually already captured and convicted along the same lines of theological conviction as the training institution. People pursue divinity school settings because they are interested in a variety of things. You know, when I was at Yale Div, you know, there were several students who I just had a lot of questions about spirituality. I'm not a believer or an adherent to any faith, traditional faith, but I want to spend the next few years talking about spirituality. That's a very common occurrence in those settings, and so I'm always trying to help people understand that the projects of the entities are a little different, so that people can set their expectations rightly, right? So when I'm in a secular divinity school environment, I'm expecting particular things that I wouldn't expect of an evangelical seminary setting. We can get into some of those things, but I think the tetheredness to theological distinctives, you'll find a little more loose, and I think that's intentional in some of these divinity school settings.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's important to understand, because that kind of lays the framework for how you're going to address schools going forward, because there's this narrative in some spaces that seminary is cemetery, and it's where you go and you lose your faith. But understanding the differences between divinity schools and seminaries can kind of be helpful when people are making this assumption that this is going to be a place where you go to lose your faith. I noticed you started at Vanderbilt for your undergrad in religious studies. So my religious studies was at University of North Florida, and I got the kind of Bart Ehrman was our textbook. There was the kind of orthodoxy was frowned upon. Did you have a similar experience at Vanderbilt, or?
Yeah, so I was a kind of late bloomer theologically, and majority of my time at Vanderbilt was spent. I was a pre-med major, so I was originally a neuroscience major for the first 3 years, and ended up transitioning to religious studies because of some kind of personal felt callings at that time. I wouldn't describe my time there as encountering any kind of antagonism, but rather, again, that kind of diversity of perspective, right? And so at Vanderbilt, it's kind of the first time where I heard the name Rudolf Bultmann and was thinking about notions of mythologization of the Bible and how to rightly regard those things that were certainly contrary to teachings that I had growing up. I grew up National Baptist Convention, kind of traditional Black Baptist church context. And so by and large, in a Bible believing context. And so I think Vandy was my first time really intellectually engaging with people who just believe vastly different things than I did. And rather than being put off by that, I was intrigued because it challenged me to think about why I believe my beliefs, and then how to articulate those and commend those in a setting where they weren't shared. And so I saw a skill being honed at that point that would go on to serve me for years, even in my work today. And so it wasn't antagonism per se. You certainly had your professors who you probably know, just not trying to get with all of that fundamentalism or whatever they might peg you as. But by and large, it was just a diverse conversation. And what you'll find in spaces like that, and I always try to again encourage people to understand going in, and I think this is helpful, I kind of appreciate it. The fundamental assumption is not theological conservatism, right? It's not a given in those conversations, in that discourse, which again I think is more helpful, right? I think we all view that as helpful than a threat, because again it challenges you to unpack some of your presuppositions, right? Rather than sitting at a table where you already know where we all are. That does you a disservice, I think, in the long run.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, and I think, when you're talking about kind of what goes along with this idea of conservative theology, it being fundamental in nature, what I'm seeing a lot of too is conservatives conservatism and orthodoxy being also thrown in with racism. So people see them as one and the same. So, but then when I talk to some of my friends that go to more mainline Duke, and they experience racism at those spaces too. So it's kind of like, well, liberalism isn't the cure for racism, because if that was the case, then why are those institutions that are more liberal logically experiencing some of those things of racism? It might not look the same. In some spaces, you may have more microaggressions in those spaces, and then maybe more outright conservative spaces. Did you have any issues with racism or prejudice at any of your mainline divinity schools or your seminary experiences?
No, I think that's a good point you raise. That's even a current conversation on Capitol Hill. I have friends who work for Republican offices and Democrat offices, and both lament some biases that they experience almost on a daily basis along racial lines. I think that's true. And certainly I would say yes. Even in spaces where Protestant liberalism perhaps, or even post-liberalism, perhaps was a kind of reigning theological orientation, I think it's important to realize that a lot of, fundamentally, what we deal with in terms of engaging and experiencing racial bias runs deeper than a kind of professed theological distinctive, right? I think in our understanding in the history of American Christianity, we realize how a particular conception of the Christian narrative and Christian claim was very much so tethered to a racist ideology, right? To kind of view those two things as compatible. But even antedating that, right? Even in some of the Greek philosophies, you have notions of different tiers of human value and dignity, right? And I just want to point to that and as an example of how you can have a kind of racialized system and structure and people propagating that regardless or across the board of theological distinctives, right? I think fundamentally it goes to how we view and how we value different image bearers, right? And the particular narratives that we give credence to about the value of different people groups. And so, yeah, you would see the most liberal of a professor or student in some of these divinity school spaces. And yet, in conversation, easily discernible that they too hold some of the same stereotypes about people groups that you would typically lament and tag to people on the conservative right. Again, I think we've kind of all been kind of trained, indoctrinated in this kind of tiered understanding of human dignity and value, that it takes a very intentional effort to debunk and to disrupt. And so certainly experience at the student level and at the professor level across the board.
Mm-hmm. I've been seeing on social media some statements, and I've made them myself, that in choosing a seminary as an African American, you almost have to sacrifice orthodoxy or sacrifice social justice. If you go to a more, mainline school, they're going to be heavy on justice, liberation. If you go to a more conservative space, they're going to be heavy on orthodoxy. And for African Americans who understand the importance of both, it's kind of hard to navigate seminary spaces without being frustrated if you're committed to orthodoxy and justice. Do you find those to be frustrating realities in the spaces that you've occupied and still do?
Yeah, I mean, sure. It kind of undergirds why I pursued the trajectory that I did, right? And so after Vanderbilt, again, which I enjoyed, feeling a very burdening call towards ministry, wanting to be trained in an evangelical space, trained in orthodoxy, if you will. So I started out at Dallas Seminary, Dallas Theological Seminary, and then transferred to Southern Seminary. But my eye was always towards making sure that kind of in my preparation and my training, I had a healthy balance, right? I think one of the burdens that we have, as one of my mentors says, is we have to take all this theological orthodoxy, quote unquote, that we get and understand, and dip it in chocolate. And what he means by that is not simply trying to show how one can commend it in communities and spaces of color, but to have a rereading of the historical narratives that undergird these theological claims, with an eye towards the historical narratives of how these theological claims impacted and intersected with communities that we come from, right? And so it involves a double work, right? It involves understanding what I call the upper side of history, meaning the kind of the triumphal reading of history, those in power, which sadly is usually the narrative along the lines of American Christianity. That's usually the narrative that is told, but also reading it from the underside, those that lack power, and how Christianity was complicit in a lot of those tragedies, right? We're burdened with the task of doing that double work, but I think we ultimately end up better for it. One of the ways in which I tried to make sure that my own preparation had a both and was pursuing both evangelical spaces and secular academic spaces. Because while we might lament some of the theological priorities of certain divinity school spaces, it was in these spaces where you get the access to the primary and secondary sources that we have to be well versed in, right? So my advisor when I was at Yale doing that second master's, incredible historian named Clarence Hardy, he did his PhD under James Cone. And so Cone has been a long conversation partner for me, even as I try to understand my own theological convictions, and in many ways give an apologetic for what would be the reasons why a person like Cone embarked on the journey that he did, right? And he gives this narrative in the 40th edition of his Black Theology of Liberation. But I valued that relationship with my advisor. I valued those relationships with those professors who didn't share my theological convictions, but had much to offer in terms of being trained as an archivist, historical archivist. We're doing great work themselves in terms of providing interventions in historiographies that needed interventions. And so we have to take the best of both worlds in order to make sure that we're formed in a holistic way to advance the things that we're trying to advance. What it means experientially is some headache, right? It means that we constantly feel a kind of Du Boisian two-ness within Christendom, right? Du Bois is making that claim about just being Black in America, but we feel it within Christendom, right? And we have to burrow through that. And I certainly experienced that as I made choice of the training and academic trajectory that I have. But it was intentional for that purpose. There were things that I didn't get or couldn't get at Evangelical Seminary, even though they're making strides. I want to say that. It's slow strides, but they're trying. But I knew that I would definitely get at in the secular academic space, right? And I'm always trying to encourage people to seek out those opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I definitely agree. I think, things that have shaped me have been the firsthand experiences. I always tell the story of me being at the Academy of Preachers, and that's where you're going to have your more, mainline divinity school students, and being one of the only people there that went to a conservative evangelical space, and how that shaped me and kind of laid the framework for why I even do courageous conversations. Yeah. And then going to University of North Florida and doing religious studies there, and then you get that both and that's so crucial. I think that helps shape you and be a better balance.
Yeah, that's right.
Balance. Were you going to say something else, or? Yeah,
I was just, it produces in you certain sensitivities, right? Sensitivities that you probably already have just by virtue of your experience, right? Both in religious spaces and in the broader culture. We kind of bring those sensitivities into our training, but then having that kind of shaping that engages both theologically conservative spaces and more secular spaces, it produces in you certain intellectual sensitivities, right? Where, again, you don't assume things, or you don't leave things unpacked and unnuanced, because you understand that both history and our contemporary context is just more colored than particular narratives might want to tell. And again, and I keep going back to this point, it has so helped me for this current moment that we live in, because there are just certain narratives that I cannot abide, and I'm insistent on calling out when I encounter them, that don't help the cause, right? And the irony is, many people would be led to believe that giving those simplistic narratives and making sure that a kind of triumphal reading or sacred reading of American religious history, American Christian history in particular, is what is going to preserve some of these things that we want to preserve. But that actually does the exact opposite, right? Because we're living in a time where those kind of narratives are going to always be called out. And so having those sensitivities kind of baked into you because of the diversity of your experiences primes and preps you for this current cultural moment in ways that individuals who have only existed in theological silos find themselves currently incapable and ill-equipped to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
How do you challenge those who are in the more left spaces, like you're at Harvard now, that may think you're in a type of sunken place because you are Orthodox in your belief and would line more to conservative principles?
Yeah.
And then how do you challenge your conservative brothers and sisters to be more open-minded in their sometimes narrow thinking about the left?
Yeah, that's a good question. The sunken place, huh? One of the, no, it's real. It's real. One of the things that will hopefully characterize, the work that I eventually become my dissertation is I'm focused on early American 18th, 19th century Black Calvinists. And my aim, and this is early, I'm still about to start the coursework phase, so this all could change. But my aim is hopefully to maybe do an intellectual history on a group of folks, or maybe just one person, demonstrating that there is a tradition, right, of what we would in our contemporary context call a theological conservatism that dovetailed with an orientation to justice, right? And so one of the things that I gently critique about narratives that are told in these predominantly secular spaces is that theological conservatism will always get you to injustice. It will always get you to racism. It will always be on the quote unquote wrong side of ... I'm trying to raise counterfactuals to that point in early American history of folks who are captivated. Their theological imagination is captivated by notions, again, of what we would call theological conservatism or orthodoxy, and yet they wield them in liberative ways, right? So this would be the antithesis of what a Jonathan Edwards will do with, the evangelical theology that he is helping to form and shape, right? So it's pointing to those figures that I think contradict the narrative, the predominant narrative that I think we often are engaged with, right? How can you hold to these theological distinctives, knowing that people who held to these theological distinctives, or the socio-political context in which these theological distinctives emerged, were directly involved in complicit in the oppression of African peoples, Native peoples, etc. It's doing the hard work of showing the counterfactuals historically that disprove that point, right? And then also, I always want to remind folks that, when you think about the traditional Black denominations, I think this often gets missed in current discourse, but whether it's National Baptist Convention, Church of God in Christ, African Methodist Episcopal Church, I think if you let certain folks tell it, you know, those denominational entities are just running leftward in kind of the theological orientation, and I don't think that's the case. I think we need to ask why there is this stubborn maintaining of conservative theological distinctives from denominational entities that are founded kind of in the seedbed of a pushback to oppressive forces, right? Racist forces. How do they give an apologetic for maintaining these distinctives and yet see themselves as fighting for justice, as pushing back against racist or racialized institutions and structures wherever they may be found? I think it's because there's a historical tradition there of, to put it simply, Black folk believe in the Bible and seeing in the Bible, rightly understood, a God of justice and a God who abhors the things that we have abhor, both historically and contemporarily, right? But it's doing that within a context that views the Word of God as such and seeks to maintain an integrity of faith for the purpose and for the sake of fighting for these things, right? It sees those two things as being leaked. So yeah, I'm just always trying to kind of show counterfactuals to the person who would ask questions about why I land where I land on certain issues. To my evangelical brothers and sisters who, again, probably more often existed in theological silos, I think one of the most helpful things that I've been able to do is disrupt simplistic readings of history, right? So oftentimes in my work here on Capitol Hill, when I'm around people of the political right who hold positions on certain issues that I might agree with, one of the things that I'm always critiquing is the way in which they talk about these things, because they're often devoid of a historical reckoning, right? And devoid of nuance. And so one of the things that I'm always trying to help them understand is the history of an idea, right? That in order to land on a particular conviction, you have to trace that thing back, right? And do your work, your homework historically. And give an apologetic for the ways in which perhaps those who held the position that you hold today fumbled and dropped the ball, right, in major ways. So I that's one of the kind of current drums that I've been beating, particularly to my white evangelical brothers and sisters, is we need to make sure that we're telling an honest history as we seek to champion the things that we're trying to champion, because to not do so undermines our holding and maintaining of certain theological distinctives. It shows them illegitimate, and it causes them to be viewed as suspect. And so an accurate historical reckoning, I think, is helpful. Again, particularly with a view of American Christian history that is often viewed as sacred and triumphalized in ways that I don't think are true or helpful. So those are just a couple of things that I would offer on that front.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with a honest view of history, because when I'm in my apologetic spaces with my conservative evangelicals brothers and sisters, I'm always challenging them on this notion that, you know, America is on the decline as far as morality, and then you as an African American, you step in that space and you're like, well, that narrative kind of doesn't really go with history, so you're pushing back on it. And I think that's a great point you made when we talk about going back to the point about liberalism too, and Black churches, because I have friends who have graduated from more liberal mainline schools who got jobs as pastors in Black churches, and while they don't believe in exclusivity, they'll say, man, I'll never preach that from the pulpit because I'll lose my job. So, you know, that's just, that's the reality of it, that Black churches in large part still affirm orthodox values and have very orthodox positions on things.
Well, I mean, one of the interesting things, right? I mean, going back to liberation theology again, I have a lot of sensitivities around that because I deeply understand why a theological thinker of color, when asking white evangelical theologians about what their orthodoxy has to say about what's going on in the South in the mid 20th century, they say nothing. Our theological distinctions have nothing to say about that. Yeah, I'd probably go back to my room and start writing too, and come up with a theology that does have something to say, right? But one of the things that I think is fascinating is that I think on the whole, Black liberation theology as a theological system never really took hold on the ground in traditional Black church spaces the way in which I think it was initially intended, right? In many ways, it became an academic discipline, right? And so you'll see works by like Raphael Warnock, Divided Mind of the Black Church, trying to call Black church back to what he's trying to say is a rootedness in Black liberation theology. But I would say you never saw outside of, your Trinity Uniteds or whatever, a rootedness of this theology as a system, right, in Black churches. And I think it's because, again, by and large, you have a Bible folk who are committed to certain claims and commitments, and anything that runs afoul of that, even though they may be sensitive to the orientations to justice, they're going to take issue with, right? And so you're absolutely right. There are many who go off, who are trained and rooted in Black church contexts, go off to divinity schools, learn some big words, come back to the pulpit and realize folks don't care about those words. They want to know what thus saith the Lord, right? That deserves a question, right? That should cause some pause. And I think one of the things that we do to our disservice that I lament is oftentimes people in the pews are tagged and regarded as, oh, well, they just, they're just backwards folks, and we just got to labor with them and try to train them up and educate them. I think some humility is deserved there about why that mother on the front row wearing her hat believes what she believes. So yeah, I've seen that too.
So for I know our time was about gone, but for those who want to read more on this topic or just read more around kind of the both and experiences and how to navigate those on the left and the right, what resources would you recommend?
Yeah, well, first let me say, I'm always asked, because having the, I did an MDiv at Southern Seminary, and then just by God's kindness, was able to engage the spaces that I engage now. I always say that I wouldn't have pursued that Yale master's and certainly not this PhD at Harvard if I had not had the experience and training that I did at Southern, right? That's not to say that that I would commend that as a blanket case across the board, but I would say what helped me engage well in the kind of secular academic spaces is a rootedness in the theological distinctives that I hold to, right? It prepared me to have more substantive dialogue around those diverse tables. And so I would just encourage folks, one, to not totally disregard the experiences if they're in evangelical seminaries, and certainly continue to pursue those. I think they're important. But in terms of setting one's expectations right, works that I think would be helpful to read. Anthony Bradley has a work, I'm blanking on the title, something like Black Faces and White Spaces or something like that. If they just Google it, I think it's like Black Faces and White Spaces, but he's talking about some of the experiences that you and I have unpacked it that I think do map on to the question of how to pursue and how to view theological education at the academy. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there are works that are written, because one of the things that I think I found is there wasn't a helpful outline that I followed, right? Even as I was pursuing these spaces, you know, people who wrote my recommendations, it is something that people view as needing a strict warning, right? You don't go into these kind of spaces that don't share your theological commitments. And I just disagree with that, right? I definitely want to say that I understand the warning involved, and I would certainly caution individuals as well. But there wasn't a kind of ready-made map for me. I was simply just pursuing spaces because of a burden and a calling to be in these spaces where narratives are told that I want to hopefully make some interventions in. Yeah, so maybe when this is posted, I'll have some works that I can put in the comment section, but there really isn't, I think, a mapping out, and I would say is needful, of how to view, particularly from an African American standpoint, how to view theological training and how to view seminary versus academy. I just think it ought to be pursued humbly and with wisdom and with a lot of people speaking in and advising. I've given certain individuals a commendation to pursue the secular space, and I've given others pause based off of things that I perceived in that individual person, right? And I think that's definitely part of it. I think some are called to pursue and should. I think others are not, and it's a matter of discerning what you feel God is calling you to do and wanting to do in your life. So yeah, outside of works, what I really have is a litany of principles that I think would help guide someone into making a kind of decision like this.
Awesome. Well, how can people get in touch with you on social media? Is there a website? Are you active on social media?
You know the answer to that. My Twitter game is putrid. I do have a Twitter handle. It is smharris_. I think the best way to get in touch with me though would be email, and again, you can leave that on the or tag that on the video. In this season, and again, this is part of it. When you're pursuing this kind of academic trajectory, there's not a lot of time left to be visible on social media. Not as much as I want to be. Again, I'm married, I have a son, and I work full time, and I'm trying to pursue a PhD full time. So I leave the social media debates up to other people who are more able than I, and I check in where I can. But email is probably the best way to get in touch with me, and I can give it here if you want me to, or we can leave it.
I can leave it there. I can leave it in the comments.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. This has been a rich time, and I think people are really going to be blessed by this. This is not a conversation that we see a lot, but I think it's very, very crucial and important for us as African Americans that are pursuing higher education.
Well, sure, I agree, and appreciate you having me on. Look forward to engaging any folks with any questions. I'm still trying to figure it out myself, so check back with me in 5 to 7 years, which is how long this degree is.
All right.